Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Policy Wall of ORF Middle East. My name is Leigh Mante. I'm a junior fellow in climate and energy. I am pleased to be joined by Mauricio Bianco, Vice President of Conservation International, Brazil. In this role, Mr. Bianco provides strategic and programmatic direction for the Brazil Conservation International Office. He works to identify opportunities and trends to achieve positive impacts for the people and environment of Brazil, with an emphasis on nature-based solutions to climate change, sustainable development, and building partnerships. Mr. Bianco, it's a pleasure to host you on our podcast today. Today, we will be conducting a deep dive on the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, or TFFF. TFFF is a novel and innovative forest financing mechanism that will be launched at COP30 this upcoming November 2025. In essence, the TFFF will mobilize public and private finance and provide performance-based payments to tropical forest countries for maintaining forest cover. This mechanism was initially spearheaded by tropical forest countries such as Brazil, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ghana, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and has already been backed by potential sponsors, including the United Arab Emirates, France, Germany, Norway, and the United Kingdom. And I would like to begin our discussion by asking you, Mr. Bianco, if you could please give us a rundown of the structure of the TFFF, particularly regarding the fund mobilization and disbursement process to communities and governments.
Thanks for inviting me for be part of this podcast. I really appreciate. So let's keep on the question that you just brought. Well, the Tropical Forest Facility it creates a new climate finance model. So where countries that conserve the tropical forests will be financially rewarded through this global investment fund. So in a way, TFFF, I believe it corrects a market failure where nature is not rewarded by its ecosystem services. So it's a way of correcting this, I think. In this way, conservation becomes more, let's say, economically advantageous. So, and also creating social and economical development in the countries that indeed are protecting forests. So it's a global tool for payment for environmental services, as we say, right? So specifically regarding mobilization of funds for this financial instrument, the TFFF aims to raise at first 25 billion US dollars. And this will come mainly from sovereign debt from countries. And those 25 billion US dollars are expected to leverage additional 100 billion US dollar from private investment as bond market, for instance. So this will be done at low interest rates and also a low risk assets. So then the funds will reinvest in corporate bonds with a higher rate of return, of course. And then the money borrowed by the TFFF will be returned back to investors and with interest, and the surplus will pay for forest protection. So by the other side, regarding the disbursement of the funds to the countries, I mean, paying the countries who successfully conserve their forest, this will be done based on area. This will be done on hectares protected or restored. So the tropical forest nations that will be part of the TFFF will present their programs, which we believe will be from public policies to the TFFF board to be created. And after rigorous assessment of those programs, funds should flow to these programs, ensuring that they will support conservation and ideally also benefiting people. So since the beginning of this announcement of this TFFF at COP28 in Dubai, Conservation International with other organizations, it's playing the role of technical aspects of the mechanism by having, CI scientists building like the eligibility criteria, the monitoring protocols, for instance, to define what kind of forest should be funded. So among other technical aspects. And we're also engaging with countries to be part of the TFFF, either tropical forest nations and potential funder countries. So at CI, we strongly support this innovative global financial mechanism.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview and for delineating both the mobilization and disbursement process. It'll be very helpful for our audience. And so my next question is regarding how you see TFFF implementation unfolding in the context of a country, a tropical forest country like Brazil, and what advantages do you see it bringing to tropical forest countries more broadly?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't believe there is no precedent on a global wise financial mechanism that creates a source of predictable, long term, and non ODA finance. To pay developing countries for a public good which is invaluable, which is nature. So this is a result-based payment going only to those countries that succeed in protecting forests or restoring ecosystems, right? So Brazil has been accessing different kinds of funding for nature, like multilaterals as the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, like a Green Climate Fund, and also private funds, like philanthropic and corporate funds. But we know that these kind of funds are not enough to close the huge gap, the huge funding gap to fund nature as a key element to climate and biodiversity. So we need all kinds of sources of to meet, to close that gap, and in order to meet the global climate and biodiversity goals. So finance flows for nature-based solutions must increase, I would say, at least 10 times. So saying that there's this main benefit for Brazil and the other tropical forest countries, which is predictable and long-term funds to protect forests.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that those advantages of this specific mechanism in terms of the predictability and having that consistency of payments. I think what countries would benefit from greatly. And within this implementation process, as well as during the launch, where do you see potential bottlenecks arising that still need to be addressed prior to this initiative as a whole launching?
Well, now, like in the current moment, I believe the main challenge is fundraising to start the financial mechanism itself. It goes from the need of engaging countries, forest nations, but even more important and challenging funding countries to come up with the first 25 billion US dollars, as I mentioned. And this it will make possible to the private capital land into the fund. And I would say this is especially challenging in the current global context that we have nowadays. I mean, the wars that are going on and globally. I mean, in the planet, international markets, tariffs discussions, which is another kind of war, right? Commercial war. So those kinds of contexts they don't help in no way for the funding part of it. And for the implementation phase, I believe we will face, expected issues related to any kind of a innovative global mechanism that we need to ensure that the funds are really deployed properly to forest protections that properly monitor by national or global satellite tools any other cards of any other sort of things that are inherent to a big mechanism like this one. To be honest, I personally think that we will face several challenges in all the phases. But if we are serious in dealing with the climate crisis, and we know that nature could represent at least 1/3 of the solutions for the climate crisis and for the biodiversity loss, we need to begin with an instrument like the TFFF, that funds nature in scale in the best way as possible so far. So I believe it's important to prioritize to ensure that TFFF it's fully operational with a focus on building from solid foundation rather than delaying for perfection, I would say. So the simplicity that comes along with the TFFF, I believe is a strength and should be preserved to ensure like a swift deployment of the funds. So the mechanism can and should be strengthening over the time based on the experience and and mainly on the evolving needs and evolving technology, right? So more than ever, we need to speed and scale.
Mhm. Mhm. And do you have any insight into the fundraising strategy regarding the initial fund mobilization of the 25 billion that Brazil and other tropical forest countries want to undertake in order to get the TFFF running and off the ground at COP30?
Yeah, yeah. You just mentioned some countries that are committed to fund the mechanism, which are the UK, the United Arab countries, and Germany, Norway. So we have several countries that are already committed to fund those. And I believe in the coming months, like having, like New York Climate Week, like right now, the African Climate Summit, all those moments will be important for this group of 12 countries that are composing the interim steering committee, try to engage those countries to make sure that we can reach the closest possible of the first 25 billion US dollars.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that clarification. My next question is regarding how TFFF fits within the fuller landscape of forest financing mechanisms. The concept note claims that TFFF will complement these other forest financing mechanisms. Do you agree with this notion? And in its current state, how well do you think TFFF can learn from the challenges of other financing mechanisms like REDD Plus, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I absolutely agree that TFFF it's a complement of the financing mechanisms that we have in place right now. And you mentioned Red Plus, which I believe it's one of the main ones that are there, which I believe it's really crucial funding mechanism indeed. I mean, the Red Plus. So overall, carbon markets are a proven tool that needs to be strengthening and scale. Carbon markets have already mobilized billions of dollars in climate and nature financing, and they remain one of the most scalable mechanisms to direct private sector capital into forest protection, and also ecosystem restoration for emission reductions, right? So I believe that the continuing evolvement and development of carbon market and its integrity are critical for long-term climate success. And I see that while Red Plus provides payments for measurable greenhouse gases reductions from deforestation and degradation, which are carbon flows, and also for carbon removals from restoration. By the other side, TFFF, in a complementary way will provide funds to protect forests based in area. So I mean hectares, right? Which are forest stocks. So by paying for full range of ecosystem services that forests provide to all of us. So ultimately, I believe that together TFFF and the Red Plus create like a robust forest finance ecosystem which is capable for addressing both short-term emissions mitigation and long-term conservation needs. And I believe that by COP30, which is right there, we have the great opportunity to show this integrated forest strategies, leveraging the complementarity between TFFF and REDD Plus to scale up forest finance.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point that you make, especially touching on the need to kind of reform the integrity of carbon markets to really fully realize their potential. And if all goes well, combining both of those mechanisms will help to channel the financing to much needed forest restoration projects. And so my next question veers onto the role of indigenous territories and local populations, which is something that the COP30 agenda really hopes to prioritize. And the version 3 of the TFFF concept note claims that it will disqualify states who fail to direct 20% of the funding to IPLCs and establishes national steering committees chaired by IPLC groups. Do you think these efforts to elevate the role of IPLCs are sufficient? If not, what more can be done?
Yeah, it's important to mention. I mean, I've been, going along the TFFF design from the beginning, and funding indigenous people, local communities was always on the table and was like an important issue to be addressed. We see more and more that indigenous people and local communities are demanding for direct access to resources, which I believe is super, super important, in fact. So by establishing that at least 20% of the TFFF funds will be directed to IPLC, I believe it's a very important beginning of a source for long-term fund availability. I mean, because then indigenous people and local communities will not need to depend on the context of funds that come from, like ODA finance, for instance, from countries that are subject to how the wind is blowing, sometimes it blows to one side, sometimes blows to the other side. So depending on the context. So TFFF will bring like a more stable and predictable funds to IPLC, so they can properly plan how to use these funds. It's well known, as you probably know, that the fundamental role that IPLC plays in protecting nature. So ensuring that a permanent and long-term fund to support the surveillance for their territories, their life plans, and their practices, it's very important in my point of view. So in the current phase of the design of the TFFF, what is being done is like a more global look to the IPLC needs to kind of prioritize this. But right after the TFFF becomes operational, the tropical forest nations will need to do their own proper consultations, country by country, to ensure that indigenous people and local communities from each country will access the funds in a proper way. So they have different protocols of consultation and all this. So this will need to be done at country level to ensure that those funds will reach and are direct used by IPLCs.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good clarification point, that this is context specific by countries, and they will need to decide how to channel that funding. And if they don't channel that funding, then they will no longer receive the TFFF funding. That's correct, right?
Yeah, the countries they have their own sovereignty to how to use the funds. So, and each country with its own indigenous people, local communities, they have their own way of, channeling those resources, always consulting them, making sure that they are the ones choosing what to do with the resources, right? So, I believe right now in a global perspective of the design, it's like a more overall view of it. But I believe the importance of deploying the funds at national level to make sure that it applies for every nation, which is different. It could be different from country to country.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. My next question is, how else can this financing mechanism work to move the needle in order to address the systemic issues such as land rights and other economic drivers of tropical deforestation?
Yeah, I mean, I believe when you start properly funding the forest standing, we begin monetizing nature, right? And in a good sense, okay, as an asset that could be creating, proper development for, climate, biodiversity, and people, right? So just by doing that, you start providing clear incentives for protection, also for sustainable production and restoring critical ecosystem. So besides the multiple benefits of a mechanism like a TFFF, I believe we will start seeing like a domino effect for other economic drives to start coming, to avoid deforestation, right? Particularly in Brazil, land tenure, it's an important issue that needs to be addressed. Most of any kind of public policies and economic benefits are related to have their proper rights to owning the land, or having the land in its own. So I truly believe that this kind of mechanism will be beneficial to address this. We will see, in fact, further benefits, social and economic, also by funding healthy forests.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. And aside from TFFF, what alternatives would you propose to help bridge the tropical forest financing gap?
Well, the financing gap, it's a big deal, I think. We're currently facing 700 billion US dollars annual financing gap for nature. And depending on the source that you look to you might find different figures. But I can tell you, all of them show a huge funding gap. So nature-based solutions receive mere 3% of climate finance, despite offering up to 30% of the mitigation needed to reach the 2030 goals, that the global goals that we all set that needs to be reached, right? So I personally don't believe in a single strategy to deal with this huge funding gap. Um, we need to make use of all sources of available funds to fund nature. For public funds, the usual suspects, government budgets, multilaterals, ODAs, going through a more innovative ones as carbon credits, biodiversity credits, payment for environmental services, green bonds, debt for nature swaps, And I would say that tapping into private funds, I mean, funds that coming from commercial investments, it's where big funds will come in Rio. I mean, making the case that funding nature will pay back to investors, I think it's super important. And there are some successful examples on that out there that prove that it's possible and really, change the current development model worldwide for a more sustainable, long-term, fair, and inclusive development.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring up about combining TFFF with not just carbon markets, but also biodiversity credits and other mechanisms as well, like green bonds, in order to fill that really large gap. And my last question, actually, with COP30 coming up, is how do you ensure that that synergies are met and efforts aren't duplicated between like a biodiversity COP and then a climate COP? How do you ensure that the agendas are on the same page and that countries are merging these two efforts in order to reach one common goal?
Yeah, I mean, even before jumping to the COP, TFFF represents a mechanism that tackle the three conventions: the climate one, the biodiversity one, and the avoiding desertification. So that's an important instrument that tackle the three of them. And since I believe TFFF will be one of the main outcomes for COP30, it I would say can be an example highlighting the purpose of connecting the three conventions. We see more and more both in the climate COPs and also in the last one, biodiversity COP in Cali, that more and more they're looking for integrating their needs, and maybe that will become really through like a mechanism like this I just said, but also in the negotiations, because we know that by having good, I mean, positive benefit to one, it will automatically help the other one. I mean, biodiversity and climate. So I believe it's a matter of every country that from the 198 countries that are part of the UN conventions, they start bringing solutions that can tackle first both things, as we can call it, the low-hanging fruit, let's say. I'm absolutely sure there's some specifics for each one, but the ones that combined, I mean, that done, we will reach two of them. I think we will have a better gain in prioritizing that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. That's a really good point that you make, that this mechanism kind of addresses three very different issues just in its nature and in what it aims to protect. But thank you so much for joining us today to better understand the tropical forest rubber facility's structure, its potential applications, the potential opportunities and challenges as well with deploying this mechanism at the upcoming COP. Your time and insights are very well appreciated. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Leigh, and also to the ORF Middle East for having me, and it's a pleasure.